I played Dark Magician at YCS Niagara. The weekend came and went, but before going into a recap, the deck list, and breakdowns and other details during the event, I wanted to give a quick thank you to everyone who approached me this weekend. It was wonderful to meet you all, and thank you to the group I traveled with for making it such a memorable weekend. We'll begin talking about the main event and how we ultimately fell short of the goal. We didn't do particularly well in the main event simply due to the fact that we weren't prepared, and I'll get into why that was later on in the video. In round 1 of the day, we match up against Fluanderies. And game 1 was a situation where I just wasn't able to win. Not because I played poorly or the deck played poorly, but simply the Runick cards prevented me from entering a battle phase to beat my opponent. The Runick cards did everything they needed to do outside of drawing freezing curses. I didn't see it all game, and it was incredibly frustrating. After a 45-minute game 1, we ultimately lost in time because my opponent was up on life points. However, I felt like I was in a position where I could have won, and that's the reason I didn't scoop. The thought was with a minute left on the clock, I said, do I scoop and go into game 2, activating a Runick card in the end phase, gaining life points, or do I attempt to beat my opponent on my next turn without activating a Runick card? However, because of a slight miscalculation, it did end up costing me round 1. I did feel like I was able to win the game to game 1 if I did have a few extra minutes on the clock. I promise you I probably would have won game 1. However, this minor miscalculation did end up costing me the round. Round 2 is something I don't think I'll ever forget for the rest of my life. A big part of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Bucket list was checked off that day when my opponent and I were selected to be the round 2 feature match for YCS Niagara. The nerves were really unsettling, but we managed to play some very good Yu-Gi-Oh! On screen, you'll find a screen recording of the article. I highly recommend you and encourage you to check it out and read the play-by-play for yourself in the link below. In the future, I will go over a match on stream or in a video, but you can read it for yourself. Our opponent was playing Runick Stun, and this was one of our more favorable matchups for our deck simply because we were playing a Runick Mirror match, but our engine allowed us to do a little bit more. After building our board in game 1, our opponent hit us with a Winged Dragon of the Raw Sphere mode after we made a full board, but we managed to climb back and win that round with the follow-up we generated in our first turn. Our second game, it was a pretty commanding win. Essentially, we let our opponent play as we didn't open up any hand traps, and he ended up just setting a few cards with Fountain on board and a few cards in hand. We essentially broke his entire board, as well as playing through any and all interruptions he had. We broke his board, set up our own to the point where he was left with pretty much no cards in hand and no cards on field. He ended up setting a monster, and we beat him on the follow-up then and then. We pretty much put ourselves in a position where our opponent wasn't able to recover from us breaking the board, giving us a swift 2-0 win in round 2. Once again, I want to thank Konami for selecting me to be in this feature match, selecting me and my opponent to be in this feature match. It was truly a blessing and something I won't ever forget. Moving on to the next rounds, which saw me get mathematically eliminated from the main event, the main takeaway was preparation. I still stand by this deck and I believe in this deck, and with some revisions and altering different lines, I think I know how we'll move going forward. The biggest thing was simply testing for the YCS as I was preparing for a heavy U-Bell matchup. I thought it was going to be the best deck in the room, and I thought it was going to be the most represented deck in the room. That was not the case. If I played in the YCS a week prior in Cancun, I feel like this list would have done significantly better. But because this wasn't the case, I played 0 U-Bell throughout all of the matchups in the main event. I did play Runick Stun, Snake Eyes Fire Kings, Tempai, and Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. Alternatively, the Molchami Fulleros addition to the format was also something that was a huge oversight. I was heavily under the impression that I was going to see a lot of side deck play, which wasn't the case. Almost every single one of my games opened with draw phase, activate Molchami. Overall, I do believe in this deck. I think it's very strong, and with better preparation, I think we have a better day. We did have some amount of success during the side events, which I'll go over later in the video, but for now, I will finish the recap of the main event. Moving on to round 3, we played against Snake Eyes Fire Kings, and this is going to be the theme for the rest of the main event. We simply weren't prepared. The new Azamina cards added so many layers to the best deck in the format, and I simply wasn't prepared for it. Game 1, he built a board I wasn't able to break, and game 2, through Molchami Fulleros, I built the board that he wasn't able to break, and game 3, unfortunately, I saw no Runick cards and no side deck cards that I sided in. With just the DM engine in my hand, it unfortunately wasn't enough to break an uninterrupted Snake Eyes Fire Kings end board, and with that we find ourselves in a huge hole for the rest of the day, trying to claw our way back into the main event. Moving on to round 4, which ultimately ended our day, we matched up against Tenpai, and after winning the dice roll not knowing what our matchup was, we decided to go first. In game 1, we built our unbreakable god board, which Tenpai just couldn't break. Moving on to game 2, our opponent made us go first. We unfortunately bricked. We opened unplayable to the point where we had to normal summon Rod, search Soul Servant, and pass. This ultimately ended up in a swift game 2 loss. Moving on to game 3, we let our opponent go first, which unfortunately was the final mistake I made that day. Simply put, Runick cards prevented me from winning the game on the spot. My opponent ended on Seal's Pass, and with the Runick cards plus my engine, I was able to dismantle his board. However, with no battle phase, I wasn't able to game my opponent then and then. And this was, simply put, the silliest mistake I could have made. In hindsight, I probably should have just went first and established the best board I could possibly make without having to waste resources trying to break my opponent's board. And because of this, my opponent had enough gas to essentially on the crackback. A very novice mistake on my end ultimately ended my day in a swift X3 record. We did end up playing one more round after that, which we did have a positive result against Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. We did, however, drop after that, and that ultimately ended our day 1 experience. Taking some time now to go over the list I took with me to the event, I do want to emphasize that I still do believe in this list. I think this variation of Dark Magician is very, very strong, and it's one of the better options we have currently going into not only this format and the next. I think with more preparation and more testing for what I didn't expect at this YCS, I would have seen better results. So the list is very similar to my previous deck profile. There are some minor changes, so I'm gonna pretty much fly through this deck profile. As if you do want an in-depth description of the deck, you can check out my last video. So we start off the deck with the 1 copy of Dark Magician, 1 copy of Dark Magician Girl. We follow it up with the Searchers of the deck, which are 3 copies of Illusion of Chaos. Illusion of Chaos essentially allowed us to grab us access to 3 copies of Magician Souls, the 1 copy of Magician's Rod, 1 copy of Timaeus the United Dragon, and then essentially the spells that we were playing was the 1 copy of Secrets of Dark Magic and the 2 copies of Soul Servant. Now, I think this lineup was relatively decent. I think going forward, I might cut Timaeus the United Dragon, simply because although it's it's our only in-archetype way of seeing Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, I don't think it's no longer mandatory because Souls and Toy Box gets us to Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. We also have other avenues. For example, if we open up one of the Cartesia or Quem lines that we will see later on in the deck profile, seeing them with, for example, Magician Souls plus a Runick card also gets us to Dragoon. And I'll explain how that works later on in the video. But for the time being, I think this is a Dark Magician spell and trap card count. There were situations where I did want to see Rod more in my hand, simply because Rod paired with Runick cards allows us to stack Soul Servant, which gives us access to Magician Souls, which is the most important card in the deck. So cutting Timaeus the United Dragon could have been a fairly decent idea, as Timaeus actually came up the least out of these Dark Magician's cards. So seeing 2 copies of Magician's Rod might be better going forward, but I think Timaeus' time in this particular list is coming to an end. Moving on to the next part of the list, we are playing the engine that turns this deck's wheels, which are the Toy Box cards. We play 3 copies of Toy Box, the 1 Toy Tank, the 1 Toy Soldier, and in my opinion, the most important cards in this particular list, which we do play the Guiding Quem and the Blazing Cartesia. Now, these cards offered unbelievable amounts of advantage for this particular list. There are situations where I did felt that Toy Box did carry me through a lot of my games, and that's to be expected. Now, the awesome thing about this list, this particular engine, is the idea of Guiding Quem and Blazing Cartesia. These 2 cards were unreal in this event, as these 2 cards facilitated all of my advantage. There were so many times where I opened up Guiding Quem with a bunch of Runick spells, and Guiding Quem and a Runick spell generated unbelievable amounts of advantage. It also turned on a lot of my Dark Magician engine. If I saw, for example, Quem with a Runick spell plus Soul Servant, that turned on my Dark Magician engine, because essentially this Quem is an entire line to dump Dark Magician into the graveyard, pair it with a Soul Servant, and off you go. Your engine is immediately online. The toy cards were really, really strong. Throughout post the after the YCS Vancouver, I started thinking about the idea of potentially cutting these and upping the number of Quests I see in the particular list. But I just felt like the amount of advantage that these toy cards produce, and not only advantage but follow-up. The ability, Toy Box's ability to reset Toy Soldier and Toy Tank to be then used on your turn 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6, etc. That comes up unbelievable amounts, an unbelievable amount. Like the Runick cards were great, but a lot of my grind game came from Toy Box and utilizing Toy Box's maximum potential. So I think this particular ratio is perfect the way it is. I do want to experiment down the line by just simply playing more copies of Quem, because I thought Quem was unreal in this list. It's so far and away, I think, the best card in the deck for what it wants to offer. Quem and Magician Souls are just so good because they build boards by themselves with the way this deck wants to function. Following that up, we are going to be going over the deck that gave it its quote-unquote meta relevance. So we are playing the 2 copies of Runick Fountain. Alongside of the Runick Fountain, we are playing Secret Village. Now, immediately you look at this and you're asking, why do you do this? Is because we are playing the 1 copy of Set Rotation. Not so much in the main event, because the main event we didn't see this card at all, but in the side events, this card was unbelievable. Essentially what Set Rotation allowed you to do is it gave you access to your Runick Fountain alongside of Secret Village. Not only that, but what Set Rotation does is it immediately forced out a lot of the Molchummies. Additionally, it essentially turned off all the infinite impermanences, and going second, it turned off Evenly Matched, which can be a massive blowout if we don't deal with it properly. Evenly Matched can blow up our board if we don't have access to Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. So Set Rotation, just being able to set your Secret Village to your opponent's side of the field and set your Runick Fountain on your side of the field, and then you just flip your Runick Fountain and off you go. Just having your opponent having the Secret Village set immediately means that the Imperm was now completely void. Imperm essentially was no longer allowed to activate, keeping your Magician Soul safe to generate you advantage, your Hugin Search to get you an additional fountain, alongside of Toy Box searching, and everything after that. Your deck just snowballs advantage if it's uninterrupted, and that's what Set Rotation allowed us to do. I do think that we can potentially cut this, but the theory was there. Although it wasn't utilized as well in the main event, in the side event, Set Rotation did come up in a few games, and Set Rotation came up a lot in testing, which I really liked. I do believe in Set Rotation and the Secret Village package alongside of the Runick spells. Additionally, seeing Set Rotation with, for example, a bunch of Runick spells immediately meant that you didn't have to utilize waste resources grabbing Fountain, because this is essentially a 1-card Fountain. Additionally, the reason why I say this forced out Molchummy is because it sets a card on your opponent's side of the field, which means if your opponent doesn't activate their Molchummy, it's immediately turned off, and at that point you chain a Runick spell to summon your Hugin or your Gary, which immediately makes your opponent go neg in a sense. So that's why I thought Set Rotation was really strong in theory. I do think that we can see some experimentation with it in the future. I do think it's a very interesting option for this particular list, specifically with a deck that relies heavily on field spells. We then play 3 copies of Runick Tip, 3 copies of Runick Destruction, 3 copies of Runick Freezing Curses, 3 copies of Runick Slumber, and 3 copies of Runick Flashing Fire. Now, these Runick cards are all relatively standard. In my opinion, Runick Destruction was the best one of the bunch. Runick Destruction put in so much work this weekend. It's so far and away the best Runick card. Runick Destruction, Curses, and Tip were unreal. Runick Slumber was actually really solid, not in the main event because I didn't play too much. I played 1 Tempai in the main event, but in the side event where they're loaded with Tempais, Runick Slumber, just protecting your board from Tempai cards is from Tempai battles are really strong. So Runick Slumber is very strong. There is an argument to potentially up the amount of Runick spells you do see, which can be a point for discussion, but that's something I'm going to be exploring later on in the future. Now we end the deck profile off with one of the best board breakers in the game right now, which is 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. Forbidden Droplet was unreal. Just if you watched the feature match or read the feature match, sorry, Forbidden Droplet just flat out ended my opponent's turn when I used it. after I got sphere moded. Droplet also going going second has unbelievable applications when paired with any of these Runick cards and or Toy Box, right? Droplet and Toy Box generates you a board by themselves, and seeing Droplet with like 2 Runick cards breaks an entire board right then and then. So I did feel like this main deck was solid, although I didn't perform as well as I'd hoped in the main event. But I do still believe in this main deck. I think that with some revision and better testing, I think we have a better tournament. There is one change in the extra deck, and there's actually a change in the extra deck that I made after I got dropped from the main event and started playing side events, and I'll get over what that is in this video. So we do play the 1 copy of Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, the 1 the Dark Magicians, which was unreal. Seeing these 2 cards together, and there were boards where I sat on both of these plus a Runick Fountain, it was just unbelievable. The Dark Magician's ability to essentially chain block your Runick Fountain and any of your Runick spells was really strong. The Dark Magicians was so far and away the one of the best performing cards in the extra deck, which is something I never thought I would say. I was astounded by how well this card performed. I knew it was going to be good in theory, but in practice, this card it printed you card advantage, and it was so good because the way this deck is going to be able to win is through the sheer card economy that the deck can generate, and the Dark Magician helps with that outright. We then play the 1 copy of Grand Guignol, and for the links, we play the 1 Cross Sheep, 1 SP Little Knight, the 1 Celine, the 1 Nightmare Griffin. One thing about Nightmare Griffin is I don't think it's that amazing right now. The Nightmare Griffin might get pushed to back into the binder simply because of the amount of board breakers that a lot of these decks play. A Nightmare Griffin is fantastic and was fantastic in a very hand trap heavy format. Just the ability to essentially get to Nightmare Griffin and forcing your opponent to have nothing but engine in their hands. They weren't able to play through Nightmare Griffin, but with board breakers, if you end on, for example, Nightmare Griffin plus an SP, that dies to like a Raigeki or a Lightning Storm or something along those lines. So Nightmare Griffin didn't perform as well as I'd hope. I think it's still a fantastic option. I think it's still an option that we should be playing, but it's something that if you don't want to play or you want to explore other options, there is an option to cut it. I do have an idea for what I want to play in this slot, but I'm going to be going over that in a future video. We then play the 1 copy of Axis Code Talker and 1 Dark the Dark Charmer. We did end up cutting the Dark the Dark Charmer in the main event. After the main event, simply because after what I deemed was Dark the Dark Charmer's only purpose was to push into access code and to get you Celine and things like that in, for example, turn 2 and 3 after you get interrupted, which is okay. But the thing I realized was that this deck doesn't need help putting bodies on board to go into these cards. So we ended up cutting Dark the Dark Charmer for a Runick Sleipnir. Runick Sleipnir was unbelievable in the side events because if you pair, for example, an SP Little Knight with a Runick card with Fountain, SP Little Knight would banish a card, and then you have the free EMZ to then activate Sleipnir, and you deal with 2 problematic monsters. So that's really, really strong. We then play the 1 Gary, which was unreal, along with the 2 Hugins. I think this is the correct Runick count for this particular list, alongside of the Muddy Mud Dragon, the 1 Chaos Angel. Chaos Angel was stupid in the side events. Chaos Angel was unreal in the side events. Just sitting on Chaos Angel plus a Fountain into any sort of Runick match, into any sort of Tempai matchups when they made you go first was crazy, because you just if you had Soul's Toy Box, or if you had, for example, Souls plus Toy Tank and like a Quem or something like that, or whatever the case was, to get you access to DMG plus any of your toy cards, making Chaos Angel and sitting on like a Runick Fountain was really, really strong, because essentially they needed to open a way to deal with Chaos Angel, or they just couldn't out Chaos Angel. It was really strong. Chaos Angel was one of the best cards in the side events. And then we followed up with the Daigusto Emerald. Daigusto caught a lot of people off guard. I got a lot of funny looks for playing Daigusto. Daigusto is essentially just a way to revive the Dark Magician to go into, for example, your Red Eyes Dark Dragoon or the Dark Magicians, which, you know, is relatively mandatory. And that's that. After you already revive your DM, you can then go into your fusion plays and off you go. Additionally, Gary can go into Daigusto if you want to keep an extra body on board, or if you extend with a Runick card. So that's it for the side deck. The only change I would probably make going forward is to replace Nightmare Griffin with something, but it's not something that I'm eagerly going to do. I do want to see where the format goes before making that decision. Moving on to what I thought was the weakest part of the deck throughout the event was the side deck. My side deck, I did not like my side deck at all. The second I submitted my list, I thought, damn, I wish I played something better in my side deck. I wish I was better prepared with my side deck. Because the thought was, and I'll get over why I thought this, but I'll just go over quickly what it was. We played the one Runick Hugin, the one Moonin, which is kind of mandatory because you're playing Runick cards and time. There was a situation where this should have came up and I miscalculated my current game state, and it never did. We then played the 3 copies of Ash Blossom, which Ash Blossom was actually one of the better performing cards in the side deck. The thought process behind Ash Blossom was you essentially let Tenpai go first, and then they set up like a seals or something like that, and then when they do the seals bounce and then the seals summon, you ash that, leaving them with nothing, allowing you to pretty much be able to build your board completely free and uninterrupted, which was really, really strong. Ash was one of the better cards in the side deck. Additionally, in the side events, I played a lot of Labyrinth for some reason. A lot of people decided that Labyrinth was going to be a meta call, so Ash in the side was really strong for that reason exactly. We then followed up with the 3 copies of Phantasme. This card was awful. The idea was that I wasn't able to get my hands on Molchummies, so I used an alternative card that kind of does the same thing, but this card was so bad that when I was able to resolve it, I did draw the 1 card, but it didn't do enough for my hand to push through, for example, a full Snake Eye Fire King Azamina board, or a Fiendsmith Snake Eye board. Like, just seeing this card, the extra card in my hand didn't do enough. The body was nice, which applied some pressure, but like I said, this card just didn't do enough for what I wanted it to replace. I wanted it to replace a lot of draws and advantage via the Molchummies, but it didn't do that, and it was very underwhelming. Same thing with Triple Tactics Talents. I thought Talents was awful. It's a card I usually swear by, but Talents did very little for me. It had very little value, both in the main and side event. I didn't like its application in the side deck. I think these 5 could be switched out for something else that I will be going over in the future. I'm not sure quite yet what I want to utilize. The next card is 3 copies of Dark Ruler No More. Now, the thought process was, hey, Dark Ruler No More can deal with Yubel. I didn't see any Yubel, so Dark Ruler didn't really do much. And the card that was, I think, the best performing card in my side deck, alongside of the Ash Blossoms, 3 copies of Evenly. Outside of Ash Blossom and Evenly, I think this side deck does need to be reworked. And the immediate thought process was, I don't think the deck needed help going second. I think playing 3 Evenlys going second alongside with the entire Runick engine and droplets would have been enough to deal with a lot of my opponent's boards that they set up. The biggest problem was I didn't have any going first side options. So I left cards in, for example, like Forbidden Droplet, which I shouldn't have done. Maybe I play Solemn Judgments. Maybe I play Floodgates going forward. For example, there can only be 1 is an option. I didn't feel like this side deck did enough going first for me. There are a lot of, or like Dimensional Barrier would have been amazing. I can't believe I didn't play Dimensional Barrier. Dimensional Barrier put in so much work for a lot of other players, and I heavily regret not playing it. So options like that should have been in the side deck, and they weren't. This is the part of the list I am most disappointed in, specifically with myself. The theory was I was pretty much, if this event was a week before, I think I'd do a lot better. But with the new cards, I just, like I said, I wasn't prepared, and that's where it starts, and that's where this experiment ends. Unfortunately, that's something that we have to learn from, and we move on and try to better ourselves going forward. After dropping from the main event, our eyes were set on some prizes and side events, specifically the Win a Mat pot of greed mat that I really wanted to get my hands on, and I entered 3 Win a Mat tournaments for that playmat. The first side event we entered, we did fall short in round 1 to Centurion against an unbelievable player. The second and third side events we entered, we ended up making the finals in both and losing in both, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we weren't able to walk away with any prizes. However, we do take away experiences and positive results for the most part when playing this particular list. I think the list did perform very well. And before ending this video, I do want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey preparing for YCS Niagara. I know it didn't go as I'd hoped, and as I'm sure that you'd hoped for this channel and for the Dark Magician community, but I assure you it's something that we will keep working on. And ultimately, the journey, even if we did well in this event, the journey wouldn't end. The idea is to make this deck as competitive as possible, and although I think we've made really good strides into figuring out what makes this deck competitively viable, I don't think we're there yet, and it's something that we will work on together. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for watching this video and every video leading up to this video. I can't thank you enough for all the comments and the support you've shown me over the last year, and it makes me keep wanting to make videos and content for you. It's something that I'm very passionate in, and it's something that I hope we can push for a long time going forward. Thank you so much for watching, and have yourselves an amazing day. Bye.